Happy Sunday, everybody. Coming at you from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're talking about this week's Come Follow Me lesson, what's in it, frankly, actually, what's not in it, what used to be in our gospel doctrine lesson when we're covering this period of the Doctrine and Covenants. We're talking specifically about Thomas Marsh. Now, we're going to get into the milk stripping story. We're going to unpack that, why it's not being shared like it was before. But who's this Thomas Marsh guy? He doesn't get a lot of airplay in the modern church. Well, he was born in 1799 in Massachusetts. He gets married on his 21st birthday. He's dissatisfied with a lot of the existing religions of the day. He thought that a new church would arise with truth. In 1830, he discovered the newly printed Book of Mormon in Palmyra, New York, where he met Martin Harris. He showed some of the Book of Mormon pages to his wife. They believed that it was divine, so the Marshes moved to Palmyra with their 3 kids in September of 1830, when Marsh is now 30 years old. 5 years later, he becomes an apostle, and being the eldest, he becomes the first president in the newly created quorum of the 12 apostles. Now, you have probably, like me, heard of Marsh's story in a very particular context in past years and decades. Here is what you and I have been taught, what we've heard from how it was told in conference by Gordon Hinckley. Take a listen.
According to the account given by George A. Smith, while the saints were in far west Missouri, the wife of Thomas B. Marsh, then president of the 12, and Sister Harris concluded they would exchange milk in order to make a little larger cheese than they otherwise could. To be sure to have justice done, it was agreed that they should not save the strippings to themselves, but that the milk and strippings should all go together. Now, for you who've never been on a farm around a cow, I should say that the strippings came at the end of the milking and were richer in cream. Mrs. Harris, it appeared, was faithful to the agreement and carried to Mrs. Marsh the milk and strippings. But Mrs. Marsh, wishing to make some extra good cheese, saved a pint of strippings from each cow and sent Mrs. Harris the milk without the strippings. A quarrel arose, and the matter was referred to the home teachers. They found Mrs. Marsh guilty of failure to keep her agreement. She and her husband were upset. An appeal was taken from the teacher to the bishop, and a regular church trial was had. President Marsh did not consider that the bishop had done him and his lady justice, for they, that is, the bishop's court, decided that the strippings were wrongfully saved and that the woman had violated her promise. Marsh immediately took an appeal to the High Council, who investigated the question with much patience. And, says George A. Smith, I assure you they were a grave body. Marsh, being extremely anxious to maintain the character of his wife, made a desperate defense, but the High Council finally confirmed the bishop's decision. Marsh, not being satisfied, took an appeal to the first presidency of the church, and Joseph and his counselors had to sit upon the case, and they approved the decision of the High Council. This little affair, Brother Smith continues, kicked up a considerable breeze, and Thomas B. Marsh then declared that he would sustain the character of his wife, even if he had to go to hell for it. The then president of the 12 apostles, the man who should have been the first to do justice and cause reparation to be made for wrong committed by any member of his family, took that position. And what next? He went before the magistrates and swore that the Mormons were hostile toward the state of Missouri. The affidavit brought from the government of Missouri an exterminating order, which drove some 15,000 saints from their homes and habitations, and some thousands perished through the suffering, the exposure consequent on this state of affairs. So Such is the account of the occurrence by George A. Smith. What a very small and trivial thing. A little cream over which two women quarreled. But it led, or at least was a factor, in Governor Boggs' cruel exterminating order, which drove the saints from the state of Missouri, with all of the terrible suffering and consequent death that followed. The man who should have settled this little quarrel, but who rather pursued it, troubling the officers of the church right to the presidency, literally went to hell for it. He lost his standing in the church. He lost his testimony of the gospel. For 19 years, he walked in poverty and darkness and bitterness, experiencing illness and loneliness. He grew old before his time. Finally, like the prodigal son in the parable of the Savior, he recognized his foolishness and painfully made his way to this valley and asked Brigham Young to forgive him and permit his rebaptism into the church. He had been the first president of the Council of the 12, loved, respected, and honored in the days of Kirtland and the early days of Far West. Now he asked only that he might be ordained a deacon and become a doorkeeper in the house of the Lord.
Now, this story has been shared in many different church manuals and periodicals and so forth. There's a book called Revelations in Context that the church not too recently put out, talking about the historical context behind some of the revelations that are compiled in the Doctrine and Covenants. In that book, it says this: within a few months, Marsh fell prey to a spirit of apostasy, as had many others. He was among several Latter-day Saints who became disturbed by the increasingly violent relationship between church members and their Missouri neighbors. Also contributing to his deepening dissatisfaction was the infamous cream strippings incident, which occurred in August or September 1838, involving Marsh's wife, Elizabeth, and Lucinda Harris, the wife of George W. Harris. According to George A. Smith, the women had agreed to exchange milk from their cows for making cheese. Now, credit where credit is due, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. That story at least tells kind of multifaceted, range of issues at play with Thomas Marsh. Not just milk strippings, but also violent relationship between church members and their Missouri neighbors. That's important for a reason that we'll get into a little bit. I want to acknowledge that in this church book, Revelations in Context, they at least address more than just, he left the church because of, this milk stripping incident. Here's how it was covered in the Gospel Doctrine Manual prior to our now Come Follow Me manual. It said that some members are deceived because of their pride. The following story illustrates how pride led Thomas B. Marsh, who was president of the Quorum of the 12, and his wife, Elizabeth, into apostasy. And then the manual goes on and shares the story. Doesn't mention the source of the story, like President Hinckley acknowledged. He said it was from George A. Smith. We'll get into that. But here in the Gospel Doctrine Manual, it doesn't even say what the source is. It just retells the story. Now, Come Follow Me removes the story. No longer is it directly presenting to the reader, to the class participant, hey, let's read from Thomas Marsh's story, or let's learn from his story. So before, it was explicitly in the Gospel Doctrine Manual. We talk about pride. We talk about the milk stripping story. It's a reminder for all of us to not, let pride lead to our downfall. But no longer is it mentioned in Come Follow Me, with one minor exception I'll share at the end. More recently, here's Elder Bednar recounting the story.
Thomas B. Marsh, the first president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in this dispensation, elected to take offense over an issue as inconsequential as milk strippings.
Okay, so what's the source here? The source, as President Hinckley said, is George A. Smith. This is Joseph Smith's cousin, He's the grandfather of later church president George Albert Smith. He's telling this story in 1856, which is 2 decades after the fact. So again, like in past musings I've shared, right, you start to get these little warning bells. Wait a minute, is this true? Is this a fabrication? Let's be a little cautious if these are later recollections. So initially, that's how I started to think of this story, or started to scrutinize this story that I'd heard for a very long time. And starting to question, okay, is the source accurate? 2 decades later, George A. Smith doesn't say he was a witness to any of this. He's just telling it as if he somehow knows it'll happen. We're unclear how. And as a reminder, in this quote, this story, he says this little affair, you will observe, kicked up a considerable breeze, and Thomas B. Marsh then declared that he would sustain the character of his wife even if he had to go to hell for it. The then president of the 12 apostles, the man who should have been the first to do justice and cause reparation to be made for wrong committed by any member of his family, took that position. And what next? He went before a magistrate and swore that the Mormons were hostile towards the state of Missouri. Now, I repeat that part of the story because it's important. George A. Smith is making a direct correlation between the alleged milk stripping incident and Marsh's going before a magistrate and swearing that the Mormons were hostile towards the state of Missouri. Now, that telling of the story by George A. Smith completely leaves out the context, that the Revelations in Context book gets right, that there was some violence by the Mormons. We'll get into that in just a moment. But George A. Smith is not sharing that context. He's saying, he got upset about milk stripping. And what next, he said? And what immediately preceded that, right? Or succeeded that? He got upset about milk strippings, pride, wanted to stand by his wife, and then he went to swear out this affidavit that the Mormons were hostile in Missouri. That's not accurate. Now, when I started my own kind of deep dive into the source of this quote, how could George A. Smith know this? Where did he get it from? There were plenty of people online on various blogs and so forth that were saying that George A. Smith made it up, that the milk strippings incident was a fabrication, that it was a folklore, tall tale, and that seemed potentially plausible. What's interesting, however, on further scrutiny is there's actually a reference in Heber Kimball's diary. This diary was kept and written by William Clayton. But in Heber Kimball's diary in 1845, so a decade before that, roughly a decade after the supposed milk stripping story, but then a decade before George A. Smith is sharing the story, 1845, it's in Heber Kimball's diary, and says, "Sometimes mere trifles destroy the confidence which each ought to have in the other. This prevents a union of faith and feeling. The apostasy of Thomas B. Marsh was caused by so small a thing as a pint of strippings, and his oaths brought the exterminating order which drove us all out of Missouri." So again, he's making this direct connection between the milk strippings incident and the extermination order, or rather Marsh's swearing out of this affidavit, the Mormons are hostile in Missouri, which prompts or helps prompt the extermination order. But interesting that here we have a source, at least from less than a decade after this alleged incident took place, still later, but it seems to substantiate or potentially corroborate what George A. Smith says. Now, what's interesting is that in Smith's story, he says that Thomas Marsh, quote, immediately took an appeal to the High Council, who investigated the question. Now, we have the contemporary minutes of the High Council at Far West, but there's no mention of such a case, which is why many of the folks online speculate that the milk stripping incident did not happen, or at least this appeal and going up through church leaders and the first presidency hearing it, perhaps that part was fabricated or embellished, if it's not in the minutes of the High Council. So that's a point on the side of, well, maybe this story didn't happen as people are claiming. Maybe the milk stripping incident did happen, but not all the church procedural, everything that followed, which is why it wouldn't be in the minutes. And perhaps that was added onto the story to kind of embellish a little bit and make Marsh look even more like the fall guy, even more like a villain for swearing out this affidavit. Okay, before we get into the affidavit, though, we got to talk about the context because there's a lot happening during this time. Now, in 1837, the church effectively imploded in Kirtland. You remember the story of the Kirtland Safety Society, the failed quote-unquote bank. They called it actually an anti-bank. And the result of that was a widespread lack of confidence in Joseph Smith by many members of the church. Heber Kimball later would say that the failure of this bank was so shattering that, quote, there were not 20 persons on earth that would declare that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, end quote. This is when Warren Parrish and his posse start a new church, which included Martin Harris. They thought Joseph was a fallen prophet. Parrish's group took control of the Kirtland Temple. So Joseph and those loyal to him leave for far west Missouri, including Thomas Marsh, who's still loyal up to this point. He's sticking with Joseph. He's one of those alleged 20 that Heber Kimball is saying are still thinking that Joseph Smith is a prophet. In 1838, things start heating up. In January, the Kirtland printing office is destroyed by arson. It's in March when Joseph and his family arrive in far west Missouri. Just a month later, Oliver Cowdery is excommunicated. And then in June, Sidney Rigdon delivers what is known now as the Salt Sermon. Sidney Rigdon was the first counselor in the First Presidency. This sermon was one against church dissenters, of which there were many. Again, just months on the heels of the Kirtland Safety Society and all the troubles of Kirtland. There's actually no text of this sermon or even like a concrete summary. All we have are observations by eyewitnesses who heard Sidney Rigdon's preaching this story against dissenters, which included Oliver Cowdery, David and John Whitmer, W.W. Phelps. This is the sermon in which he says, he's quoting Joseph, and he says, if salt has lost its savor, then, what's the purpose other than to be trodden under, the foot of men type of thing. And so this sermon prompts the formation of the so-called Danites. This was an unauthorized, secret militant society of sorts to help enforce church orthodoxy. So 2 days after Rigdon's sermon, 80 Latter-day Saints signed a statement. This is the so-called Danite Manifesto, warning dissenters to, quote, depart or a more fatal calamity shall befall you. According to John Corrill, who was an early church member and leader, he said that the First Presidency did not seem to have much to do with the Danites at first, but some of the Danites clearly saw the Salt Sermon from Sidney Rigdon as a sign of approval for their more militant, hostile approach to enforce church orthodoxy and punish and push out the dissenters. Okay, so that's in June that he delivers the sermon. 2 months later, a month and a half later, we get a violent outburst, a fight at Gallatin. Gallatin is the county seat at Daviess County, Missouri. There was an election happening, so this is where the voting was taking place. The locals did not want the Mormons to vote because they were going to vote against their chosen guy. Here is a story from one of the individuals who was present at the fight that broke out. He says that a drunken brute by the name of Richard Weldon stepped up to a little Mormon preacher by the name of Brown and said, "Are you a Mormon preacher, sir?" "Yes, sir, I am." "Do you Mormons believe in healing the sick by laying on of hands, speaking in tongues, and casting out devils?" "We do," said Brown. Weldon then said, "You're a damned liar. Joseph Smith is a damned impostor." With this, he attacked Brown and beat him severely. Brown did not resent it, but tried to reason with him, but without effect. At this time, a Mormon by the name of Hiram Nelson attempted to pull Weldon off of Brown when he was struck by half a dozen men on the head, shoulders, and face. He was soon forced to the ground. Just then, Riley Stewart struck Weldon across the back of the head with a billet of oak lumber and broke his skull. Weldon fell nearly on me and appeared lifeless. The blood flowed freely from the wound. Immediately, the fight became general. In other words, chaos breaks out. Everyone turns into a big brawl. So this violent conflict, tensions are high already, political tensions with the neighbors, the settlers, the locals who didn't like the concentrating power of the Mormons, who were all flooding into their community. 1 month later, Joseph Smith and Lyman White get called to a trial before Judge Austin King for effectively organizing an army and provoking conflict. They're bound out over for trial, imprisoned, later put on trial, and then transferred to Liberty Jail. So this is what kind of precipitates all of the lead up to the Liberty Jail episode. In October 18th, Mormons attack Gallatin and other cities in the county. Now, there was kind of a heads up given such that the residents had been evacuated already. They knew basically an attack was coming, not unlike when a military is going to, bomb a city and they put the leaflets out for the civilians to get out of there. Residents knew about this, so they had evacuated. Tensions are high. Mormons swoop into Gallatin and a couple other cities. They plunder the property. They burn the stores and houses. And 9 days later, Governor Boggs issues the extermination order. 3 days after that is when we get the Hans Mill massacre, which killed, I think, 17 Latter-day Saints. The day after, Joseph Smith and others were imprisoned and then later transferred to Liberty Jail. Now, I mentioned that the attack by Mormons in Gallatin happened on October 18th. This is just over 2 months after the attack on some Mormons that was provoked by the local voters in Gallatin. So October 18th is when the retaliatory attack happens. The following day, the day after that attack, Thomas Marsh and Orson Hyde leave the church. And 5 days later, sign an affidavit sharing their observations. Joseph Smith, for his part, harshly criticized this affidavit. He said that it contained, quote, all the vilest calumnies, aspersions, lies, and slanders towards myself and the church that his wicked heart could invent. So this is the affidavit that contributes. It's not the sole reason why the governor issues the extermination order. There's a chorus of voices. There's all kinds of people making all kinds of claims, but certainly it helped. This affidavit from the presiding apostle of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, saying what? What was in this affidavit? Let's read a relevant portion of the affidavit. Here it is. This is from Thomas Marsh, signed onto by Orson Hyde, leaving the church the day after this attack. Quote, we got to Diamond on Tuesday evening, and on the next day, a company of about 80 of the Mormons, commanded by a man fictitiously named Captain Fearnot, marched to Gallatin. They returned and said they had run off from Gallatin 20 or 30 men and had taken Gallatin, had taken one prisoner, and another had joined the company. I afterwards learned from the Mormons that they had burned Gallatin and that it was done by the aforesaid company that marched there. The Mormons informed me that they had hauled away all the goods from the store in Gallatin and deposited them at the bishop's storehouse at Adamantiama. They have among them a company consisting of all that are considered true Mormons, called the Danites, who have taken an oath to support the heads of the church in all things that they say or do, whether right or wrong. Many, however, of this band are much dissatisfied with this oath as being against moral and religious principles. On Saturday last, I am informed by the Mormons they had a meeting at Far West in which they appointed a company of 12 by the name of the Destruction Company for the purpose of burning and destroying, and that if the people of Buckham came to do mischief upon the people of Caldwell and committed depredations on the Mormons, they were to burn Buncombe, and if the people of Clay and Ray made any movement against them, this destroying company was to burn Liberty and Richmond. This burning was to be done secretly by going as incendiaries. At the same meeting, I was informed they passed a decree that no Mormon dissenter should leave Caldwell County alive, and that such as attempted to do it should be shot down and sent to tell their tale in eternity. In a conversation between Dr. Abbard and other Mormons, said Abbard proposed to start a pestilence among the Gentiles, as he called them, by poisoning their corn, fruit, etc., and saying it was the work of the Lord. And said Abbard advocated lying for the support of their religion and said it was no harm to lie for the Lord. The plan of said Smith, the prophet, is to take the state, and he professes to his people to intend taking the U.S. and ultimately the whole world. This is the belief of the church and my own opinion of the prophet's plans and intentions. It is my opinion that neither said Joseph Smith, the prophet, nor any one of the principal men who is firm in the faith could be indicted for any offense in the county of Caldwell. The prophet inculcates the notion, and it is believed by every true Mormon that Smith's prophecies are superior to the law of the land. I have heard the prophet say that he should yet tread down his enemies and walk over their dead bodies. that if he was not let alone, he would be a second Muhammad to the generations, and that he would make it one gore of blood from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean. That like Muhammad, whose motto in treating for peace was the Al-Quran or the sword, so should it be eventually with us, Joseph Smith or the sword. These statements were made during the last summer. The number of armed men at Adamant Island was between 300 and 400. Thomas B. Marsh, October 24th, 1838. Wow. Okay, there's a lot there. We're not going to unpack all of it. Point is, he's clearly responding to the hostilities that are happening. Now, he's not just referring to the Danites and the hostilities. He's then impugning the motive of Joseph Smith. He's calling into question his political ambition, his perceptions about the law of the land, whether he's subject to that law or not, his desires and all the rest. So you can see why Joseph Smith would say that it contained all of these aspersions and lies and slanders towards himself. But beyond what he's saying about Joseph, he's responding to the clear violence that is taking place. So he leaves the church not 24 hours after this attack happens. He writes the affidavit, probably takes him, a day or two or three to finally get it out. So 5 days later, he's got the affidavit. And so clearly he's taking issue with the violence. Now, he may be blowing it out of proportion. He may be distorting what he's heard from Joseph or making things up entirely to make Joseph look bad. But clearly he's concerned about the violence. Nowhere in here does it talk about milk strippings. Of course, why would it, right? He's not going to be like, oh, and they offended my wife 3 weeks ago, Like he's not going to say that. He's perhaps influenced by it. So if we assume that the milk stripping story happened, right? Forget all the appeals and the first presidency. Maybe it didn't go that far. But if he's got this his burr in his saddle and he's got this problem, maybe that like Marsh's affidavit is one of many things contributing to the governor issuing the exterminating order. The milk stripping story could be one of many things influencing Thomas Marsh to write this affidavit, to leave the church, to turn against Joseph Smith. People are complex, right? We've got multiple reasons why. And so that's why I think the kind of reductive, simplistic approach that is often taken to Thomas Marsh's story is perhaps inaccurate, unfair, because it's not telling the full tale of why he left the church and what he was upset about. No, he didn't leave the church forever. As President Hinckley shared in the story from George A. Smith, he comes back. Now, his wife died in 1854. And so a couple years later, he sets out for Council Bluffs, Iowa, to explore returning to the church. To me, this suggests that his wife's involvement may have been a significant factor in his staying out of the church, which seems to suggest that perhaps the milk stripping incident could have happened if he was standing by his wife and if there was this kind of pride resentment issue, that only after his wife dies does he then consider and explore rejoining the church. Kind of interesting timing. Maybe there's nothing to it, but seems to suggest that the wife was playing a part in his staying away from the church. So he's in Council Bluffs. He goes to meet with George Harris, husband of the wife who was on the other side of the milk stripping story. And so he meets with George Harris. To me, that's significant because if the milk stripping incident wasn't an incident or wasn't an issue, why would he go seek him out and do that? So that, again, if I'm questioning the source of the story and trying to understand whether this really happened or not, I'm like, okay, that seems to suggest it did happen, that it was an issue, right? He writes then to Heber Kimball out in Utah, asking for permission to be rebaptized. He says, how can I leave this world without your forgiveness? Can I have it? Can I have it? Something seems to say within, yes. Oh, then hasten and signify it by writing the word yes to me. And then, oh joy, I shall be content. I have met with George W. Harris, and a reconciliation has taken place with us. And when that was accomplished, I was so overjoyed that I was constrained to say in my heart, truly this is an evidence that the Lord loves me after all my rebellion and my sins. He continues, I know what I have done, a mission was laid upon me, and I have never filled it. And now I fear it is too late, but it is filled by another, I see. The Lord could get along very well without me, and he has lost nothing by my falling out of the ranks. But oh, what have I lost? Riches, greater riches than all this world or many planets like this could afford. But oh, brethren, can you speak one word of comfort to me? Can I be saved at all in the kingdom of God? Can I find peace among you? Oh, if I can but enjoy your smiles and the smiles of the church and of Jesus, I shall be content to depart and remain in so great piece. Interestingly, he's writing to Heber Kimball, who in his journal, William Clayton helps him write down, 10 years prior about this story in the milk strippings incident. So he's writing to the same Heber Kimball. He emphasizes, hey, I met with George W. Harris. A reconciliation has taken place within us. He's not, mentioning the violence and the whatever. He's pointing out that, hey, we've been reconciled. We've gotten over this. That also seems to strongly suggest that the milk stripping incident was a significant contributing factor in his leaving the church and then going on the attack. He gets baptized. He makes his way out to Utah, meets privately with Brigham Young. According to Brigham, he said, quote, he came into my office and wished to know whether I could be reconciled to him and whether there could be a reconciliation between himself and the church of the living God. He reflected for a moment and said, I am reconciled to the church, but I want to know whether the church can be reconciled to me. Brigham invites Marsh on the stand to come up and speak before the assembled saints. Here's a part of his remarks. He says, quote, the next question is, how and when did you lose the spirit? I became jealous of the prophet, and then I saw double and overlooked everything that was right and spent all my time in looking for the evil. And then when the devil began to lead me, it was easy for the carnal mind to rise up, which is anger, jealousy, and wrath. I could feel it within me. I felt angry and wrathful. And the Spirit of the Lord being gone, as the scriptures say, I was blinded. And I thought I saw a beam in Brother Joseph's eye, but it was nothing but a mote. And my own eye was filled with the beam. But I thought I saw a beam in his, and I wanted to get it out. And as Brother Heber says, I got mad and wanted everyone else to be mad. I talked with Brother Brigham and Brother Heber, and I wanted them to be mad like myself, and I saw that they were not mad. And I got madder still because they were not. Well, this is about the amount of my hypocrisy. I meddled with that which was not my business. But let me tell you, my brethren and friends, if you do not want to suffer in body and mind as I have done, if there are any of you that have the seeds of apostasy in you, do not let them make their appearance, but nip that spirit in the bud, for it is misery and affliction in this world and destruction in the world to come. Okay, interesting. Now, as I said, this isn't in the Come Follow Me manual, at least not explicitly, where it talks about Thomas B. Marsh's leaving the church and pride and so forth. And what is in the Come Follow Me manual is just a secondary passing reference under the, see also these additional resources. And it links to an article called The Faith and Fall of Thomas Marsh, where it does talk about the milk stripping story. And my concern with just talking about the milk stripping story, as President Hinckley or Elder Bednar and the Gospel Doctrine Manual and other things have done, is that they, in telling this story by focusing only on the milk strippings, I think it's not showing the full context of why Thomas Marsh apostatized, why he left the church, why he turned on Joseph. Now, I disagree with the online folks who are claiming that this is all a fabrication. I think it's legit. I think the milk stripping story did happen. Sure, we don't have Thomas Marsh in 1838 acknowledging in his own journal or anywhere saying, yes, this happened and I got pissed off and left the church. We don't have records of it from the Far West High Council. There are things to question. And so I do question whether this went all the way up to the First Presidency and became this big church governance affair, like is being claimed. We can't substantiate that, and I'm a little skeptical that it happened. However, it appears the incident itself did happen. It was recorded less than a decade later by Heber Kimball and by William Clayton in Heber Kimball's journal. And okay, he might have just heard it, could have been gossip or hearsay at that point. But the very fact that when Thomas Marsh writes to Heber Kimball seeking rebaptism and readmittance in the church, he specifically calls out his reconciliation with the husband of the other wife, that their wives were sparring and that led to Thomas Marsh leaving the church. So here he is apologizing to the husband, trying to be reconciled to him, and then calling that out to the leaders of the church out west, saying, hey, we're good now, so can we be good? Can I come back? That to me strongly suggests that it did happen and perhaps was a significant contributing factor. But the fact that Thomas Marsh left the day after the Mormons attacked Gallatin, and that the affidavit itself was noting several acts of violence by these Danites, by these Mormons, I think shows another facet. Now, one could say that the milk stripping incident was kind of the festering wound or whatever, right? And that later on, the Mormons attacking in Gallatin was just the straw that broke the camel's back, right? Like, it wasn't the primary reason that Marsh left. It was the convenient thing for him to fight back, for him to, get back at these church leaders that had slighted him and sided against him and his wife. That could very well be true. But it's too simplistic to me to only focus on the milk strippings and to say, oh, look at this prideful person, because we don't know to what extent that contributed. I do think it contributed, but I think this violent stuff also contributed. And frankly, it's a more interesting and rich narrative to understand the historical context that was happening at the time, and the fact that he was clearly responding to a concern he had, and Orson Hyde with him. That to me is interesting. And I don't want the milk stripping story used as a way to undermine more, legitimate, credible concerns that individuals have. If it's like, if Marsh indeed was deeply concerned about this violence, and if it was a significant contributing factor in his alienating himself from the church and turning on Joseph, I think it's worth us fairly representing that to the extent that, 2 centuries later we can accurately do so, because it shows the full picture. It shows Thomas Marsh in context. It helps us understand what all was going on. And just as today people can have concerns with the church, I think it would be a disservice to dismiss them superficially, to write them off without addressing the substantive side of some of their complaints. I look at Thomas Marsh and I say, okay, milk strippings, superficial; violence, substantive. Now, again, I can't say all these years later whether Thomas Marsh's signing of the affidavit and his objection to the violence was just a convenient thing that came at the right time so that he could then act on that desire for getting back at the church. I don't know. But regardless of its convenience, it was a substantive thing, and something worth considering and addressing. Now, I think Joseph Smith is right. I think Thomas Marsh is clearly blowing things out of proportion, and assigning motive and intent and so forth to Joseph that is unfair. Tensions were high on both sides. It's very clear there were Danites, there were these rabble-rousers, there were people who reacted poorly to the Salt Sermon. Tensions were high with the locals. There were physical conflicts and altercations. The Mormons were not just the total victims in all cases, right? It's history is more complex. It's more nuanced. It's not like, the Mormons were the perfect, innocent victims in all things and didn't have any problems of their own. Clearly, God acknowledges that with, how often he was rebuking the saints and telling them, you're not really been attacked, right? The Lord then gives a revelation and says, no, you're not to attack back. You're to bear it patiently. You're to suffer. You're to allow yourself to be attacked 3 times, lifting a standard of peace. So, interesting. And again, instructive to me in that those who do alienate themselves from the gospel often have complex and different reasons. Let's not devalidate them or think that their reasons are correct simply because they believe them. But as I've shared before, I know many people who leave the church, and it could be easy to dismiss that on superficial basis. Oh, they just want to sin and get away with it. They just want to not wear garments anymore. They just want to drink coffee and not pay tithing. And clearly there have been those types of responses from certain church members in certain cases over the years to kind of dismiss various people leading the church. But I think things are more complex, and I think some folks who have challenges with the church or with the gospel itself have a more complex and nuanced view that we should address if they're concerned about certain aspects of the history of the church or the governance of the church or church culture or things like that. These things I think ought to be addressed and tackled. I try to address and tackle them. I believe strongly in the gospel of Jesus Christ. I believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet, and I believe that truth should be defended. That the truth can be defended, that it's defensible, that it can withstand scrutiny. That we should criticize or rather critique in the most ideal way to try and unencumber from the truth any traditions of the fathers or anything that's been caked upon it, because we ought to, I think, know the truth. We ought to share the truth. We ought to proclaim the truth. And there are going to be plenty of people like Thomas Marsh who leave the church for various reasons, some of them valid, some of them not valid. But I think we owe it to ourselves as a minimum. I'll speak for myself. I think I owe it to myself to understand the concerns and complaints that people have. And even though they might be motivated for untoward reasons or selfish desires, which is clearly the case in many circumstances, there are things that we can improve upon. There are things that the church can do better. There are, things that we as a church community can improve that has contributed to people having objections to the way the church is, right? We should talk about these things. Our church culture, unfortunately, is one of resistance towards that, towards any critiquing. It's why I get comments on my podcast from people who are really uncomfortable with the kind of critique approach I take in trying to get at the truth, the more kind of critical thinking, and approach to this, which is fine. It's not for everybody. It's certainly contrary to how our church culture operates, but it's an exercise that I think is worth it because it helps me strengthen my testimony. It helps me get at what is truth. It helps me identify what are those traditions of the fathers that I ought to first identify, but then second reject, so that I can truly understand what does Christ want of me and what ought I to be doing, what is the truth, and how can I best share it with others. I'm glad that Thomas Marsh came back. I'm glad that he was reconciled to George Harris. I'm glad that things turned out as they did. I'm glad that he himself shared with the saints, like, don't do what I did, right? Like, I was a hypocrite and I got mad and I looked and thought I saw a beam in Brother Joseph's eye, and it was anger and jealousy and all the rest, right? I'm glad he was able to warn the saints. There are many people actually who have left the church who have come back in recent times. A number of people I'm familiar with who have gotten rebaptized, who recognize that the complaints they did have perhaps were not as substantive as they thought, or that they didn't really try and understand. They just used that convenient reason to leave the church, only to realize that life around them was kind of hollow and empty in a lot of cases, and they realized that they weren't fully appreciative of and committed to the gospel that they had once embraced. So I'm excited to see those stories. I hope more people can turn to the gospel, and I want that to happen, and think it can best happen if we unencumber ourselves from all these traditions of our fathers, if we try and get rid of our idolatry, if we truly try to commit ourselves to Christ. I've shared in past musings that I think, our doctrine ultimately is radical in the best way. That when you plant a flag and say, this is what we believe, these are the bold doctrines that we declare, that is going to alienate people, just as Jesus said he didn't come to bring peace but a sword, and the truth divides. Planting that bold doctrinal flag is going to alienate people, but it's also going to attract people to you. It's going to bring people through a magnetic force who want that in their life. They want those doctrines. They want a church organization that stands for something amid the tide of, Babylonian culture. And so that's going to be attractive to the right people who are looking for the truth and who can't find it because they don't know where to find it. That if we plant that bold doctrinal flag, if we stand up for what we believe, then we're going to be able to, I think, welcome the exact type of converts that we want in this church. We'll leave it there, guys. I'm going to go enjoy Brazil a little bit. I hope you're all having a great weekend, and I'll see you next Sunday.